It was the end of the year, and the roads were filled with travelers heading home for the holiday celebrations. Mr. Shun, a loving husband and father, was driving his family in their luxurious Range Rover. His wife, Mrs. Samisa, sat in the front passenger seat, while their 3 children, Joseph, Maria, and Adele, were in the back, joyfully singing along to the music playing on the car's speakers. The atmosphere was filled with laughter and happiness as they anticipated the warm welcome of their relatives in their hometown. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow over the highway as Mr. Shun kept his focus on the road. The highway was smooth, and with the holiday spirit in the air, everything seemed perfect. However, fate had a different plan. Suddenly, out of nowhere, another vehicle came speeding towards them. It was swerving uncontrollably, crossing lanes dangerously. Mr. Shun's eyes widened in horror as he realized that the car was heading straight toward them. He quickly analyzed his options, swerving off the road, braking hard, or hoping the other driver would regain control. But in that split second, he knew there was no escape. The other car showed no signs of stopping, and Mr. Shun knew something was terribly wrong. That driver is either drunk or has lost control, he thought. His heart pounded in his chest. His reflexes took over as he slammed on the brakes and tried to swerve to avoid the collision. "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His wife and children also saw the impending danger and screamed in fear. Mrs. Samisa whispered a desperate prayer in her heart, hoping for divine intervention. But fate was cruel. A deafening crash echoed through the highway as metal collided with metal. The impact was so intense that it sent their Range Rover spinning off the road. Glass shattered, tires screeched, and within seconds, everything went dark. The once joyous atmosphere inside the Range Rover was now replaced with eerie silence, shattered glass, and the faint sounds of approaching vehicles screeching to a halt. Bystanders who had witnessed the horrific crash rushed to the scene, some dialing emergency services while others tried to pry open the damaged car doors. Maria, who had been seated in the back seat, was unconscious. Her body lay still, her head resting against the shattered window. Blood trickled from a small wound on her forehead. The metallic scent of gasoline filled the air, mixing with the pungent odor of burnt rubber. Within minutes, paramedics and emergency responders arrived. The scene was chaotic, flashing sirens, panicked voices, and desperate attempts to pull out the victims. The responders carefully extracted each member of Maria's family, checking for signs of life. The news was grim. Mr. Shun and Mrs. Samisa had succumbed to their injuries on impact. Joseph and Adele, Maria's younger siblings, were also lifeless. The medics checked Maria, feeling for a pulse. Miraculously, she was still alive, though unconscious. "She's breathing," one of the paramedics called out. "She needs immediate medical attention. Let's get her to the hospital now," another shouted. The unconscious Maria was placed on a stretcher and loaded into an ambulance. As the vehicle sped toward the nearest hospital, Maria remained unaware that she had just lost everything: her family, her home, and the happiness she once knew. 3 days later, Maria slowly opened her eyes. The world around her was blurry, and a dull, aching pain throbbed in her head. The sterile white walls and the beeping of machines told her she was in a hospital. She blinked several times, trying to clear her vision. The first thing she saw was a familiar face, her aunt, Mrs. Victoria. Tears welled up in Mrs. Victoria's eyes as she gasped, "Maria, you're awake! It's a miracle!" Before Maria could process what was happening, her aunt rushed out of the room to call the doctor. Moments later, a doctor walked in, checking Maria's vitals and smiling. "You're very lucky, young lady," the doctor said. "No broken bones, no internal injuries. You were in a coma due to shock, but you're going to be okay." Maria felt disoriented. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. The doctor reassured her and advised her to rest. As her aunt sat beside her, Maria's mind slowly began to piece things together. She remembered the road trip. She remembered her family laughing and singing. And then, her breath hitched. The car. The other driver. The crash. Panic rose in her chest. "Auntie, Where's my father?" she asked, her voice weak. Mrs. Victoria's face changed instantly. The warmth in her eyes faded, replaced by a somber expression. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. "What about my mother?" Maria's voice trembled. "And Joseph?" "And Adele?" Her aunt looked away, unable to meet Maria's desperate gaze. Maria's heart pounded. Tears welled in her eyes as the silence stretched between them. "Auntie, please." "Where is my family?" Maria pleaded, her voice breaking. Mrs. Victoria took a deep breath, then exhaled shakily. "I'm so sorry, Maria. They're gone. Everyone died in the accident except you." The words hit Maria like a thunderbolt. No, that's not true," she cried, shaking her head violently. "We were just going to visit the village. We were happy. We were singing. No, this can't be true." Tears streamed down her cheeks as reality sank in. Her entire world had been destroyed in an instant. She was alone. Her aunt reached out to comfort her, but Maria turned away, curling into herself as she sobbed. Her father, her mother, her siblings, they were gone forever. Chapter 4: The Aunt's Betrayal. After being discharged from the hospital, Maria had no choice but to go and live with her aunt, Mrs. Victoria, and her husband, Mr. Samuel. She had no other family to turn to. With a heavy heart, she packed her few belongings, still struggling to accept the painful reality of her loss. Mrs. Victoria's home was far from luxurious. Unlike Maria's own house, which had been spacious and comfortable, her aunt's house was modest, with peeling walls and cramped rooms. Maria tried to tell herself that at least she was with family, that she was safe. For the first few days, Mrs. Victoria and her family treated Maria with warmth and sympathy. They consoled her, cooked meals for her, and assured her that they would take care of her as their own daughter. Maria found some comfort in their words, but deep down, something felt off. Then, on the second day, a stranger arrived at their home. A mysterious visitor. Maria was sitting quietly in a corner of the living room, staring blankly at the wall when she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. A few moments later, a well-dressed man stepped into the house. He was in his early 30s, wearing an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a wristwatch that gleamed in the dim light of the room. His presence radiated confidence and authority. Mrs. Victoria and Mr. Samuel greeted him with exaggerated politeness, almost as if they were nervous. Maria watched as they invited the man to sit down. Her aunt's husband poured him a drink, and they exchanged hushed words that Maria couldn't quite hear. But as soon as the man's gaze landed on Maria, an unsettling silence filled the room. Mrs. Victoria cleared her throat and gestured for Maria to come closer. "Maria, dear," she said, forcing a smile, "this is Mr. Musa. He came to see you." Maria frowned, her heart pounding slightly. "Me?" she asked, confused. Musa gave her a long, unreadable look before speaking. "I heard about your tragedy, young lady. I'm very sorry for your loss. May your family's souls rest in peace." "Thank you," Maria murmured, though she still didn't understand why he was here. But before she could ask, Mrs. Victoria interrupted. "You see, Maria," her aunt said, her tone suddenly serious, "Mr. Musa is the man your father nearly killed on the night of the accident." Maria's stomach twisted. "What?" "Yes," her aunt continued, her expression unreadable. "Your father, he was drinking that night. He lost control of the car and crashed into Mr. Musa's vehicle. It's a miracle that Mr. Musa survived." Maria felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She shook her head rapidly. "That's not true. My father wasn't drinking. He never drinks. We were all singing together before." "Maria!" her aunt snapped sharply, making her flinch. "Do not disrespect the memory of your father. You are too young to understand." Maria's eyes darted to Musa, who simply watched her, his expression cold and detached. Something was wrong. She remembered the accident clearly. Their car had been driving steadily when the other vehicles swerved into their lane. Her father had been in control. He had been the one trying to avoid the crash, not cause it. Why was her aunt lying? The shocking truth. Maria's mind was racing. She couldn't just sit there and accept this lie. But before she could speak again, her uncle, Mr. Samuel, leaned forward and placed a reassuring hand on Musa's shoulder. "Sir, we appreciate your kindness," he said smoothly. "You could have taken legal action against Maria's father, but you didn't. For that, we are grateful." Musa nodded slightly, as if satisfied with the response. Then, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Maria's heart nearly stopped as she watched him place it on the table. Her aunt's eyes flickered with something Maria had never seen before: greed. "This," Musa said calmly, "is a small token of my appreciation. Consider it compensation for your loss." Maria's breath caught in her throat. It was money. Her aunt and uncle had taken a bribe. They were selling out her father's honor, accepting money in exchange for keeping silent about the truth. Maria clenched her fists, her whole body shaking with rage. Her father was being falsely accused, his name dragged through the mud, all so that these people could profit from his death. A silent witness. Maria wanted to scream, to demand answers, to throw that envelope out the window and expose them for what they were. But something stopped her. She suddenly realized that she was alone. If she spoke up now, would they believe her? Or would they turn against her? She looked at Musa, whose face remained emotionless, as though this was just another business transaction. Then she looked at her aunt and uncle people, who were supposed to protect her. They wouldn't listen. They had already chosen their side. So Maria did the only thing she could do. She stayed silent. But in that moment, she made a promise to herself. They might think they had won. They might think she was just a helpless orphan with no power. But one day, she would make them pay. She would uncover the truth. And when the time came, they would regret ever betraying her family. Chapter 5: Abuse and Injustice. Maria had hoped that, despite her aunt's betrayal, she would still be treated with kindness as a grieving orphan. But she quickly realized that Mrs. Victoria had no intention of being her protector. She was her oppressor. From the moment Musa left their home, things changed drastically. The false warmth and sympathy her aunt and uncle had shown her in the first few days disappeared like smoke in the wind. At first, it was the small things Mrs. Victoria would snap at her over the tiniest mistakes, scold her for speaking too much, or criticize her for no reason. Then, the mistreatment escalated. A life of servitude. Maria was no longer treated as a member of the family, but as a servant. Every morning, before the sun had even risen, she was woken up by harsh knocks on her door. "Get up, lazy girl," Mrs. Victoria would bark. "Do you think this house will clean itself?" Maria, still weak from her trauma, would drag herself out of bed, her body aching. She would sweep, mop, scrub, and cook before anyone else in the house even opened their eyes. Her cousins Kunle and Ayo lounged around the house, playing games and watching television, while Maria worked tirelessly. If she finished one chore, her aunt found another for her. If she dared to rest, she was met with insults. "You eat my food and live under my roof, so you will work for it." Her aunt sneered. Maria clenched her jaw and endured it. She had no choice. But what hurt her most was when she heard the words that crushed her hopes completely. One evening, after serving dinner, Maria hesitantly asked, "Auntie, when will I start going back to school?" Mrs. Victoria let out a mocking laugh. "School? You think I'll waste my money on you?" Maria's heart sank. "But my father wanted me to finish my education. He always said." "Your father is dead," her aunt snapped, her voice cold. "And I am not your father. Your schooling ends here. From now on, your place is in this house, doing chores." Tears burned in Maria's eyes, but she swallowed them. She wanted to protest, but she knew better. The more she resisted, the worse the punishment would be. So she remained silent. But inside, she was screaming. The beginning of a nightmare. As if the harsh labor and emotional torment weren't enough, Maria soon found herself trapped in an even darker nightmare, one she never saw coming. It started subtly. Her cousin Kunal, the eldest son of Mrs. Victoria, had always looked at her strangely. At first, she thought nothing of it, assuming he was just being his usual arrogant self. But then he started getting too close. When she would be alone in the kitchen, he would brush past her deliberately, his hands lingering too long. When she washed clothes outside, he would stand too close, watching her. Maria felt uneasy. Then one night, it happened. She was fast asleep when she felt a weight press down on her bed. Her eyes flew open in terror as she realized someone was there. The dim moonlight from the window illuminated Kunal's face, his breath hot against her skin. She gasped, scrambling back. "Kunal, what are you doing?" Kunal smirked. "Relax, Maria. I know you want this too." "No, get out of my room," she shouted, trying to push him away. Kunal grabbed her wrists, pinning them down. "Be a good girl, and no one will get hurt," he whispered. Maria thrashed, her heart pounding in terror. "Help, Auntie!" she screamed. Kunal immediately slapped a hand over her mouth. "Scream all you want," he hissed. "No one will come for you." Maria's blood ran cold. She struggled with all her strength, but he was too strong. Kunal tore at her clothes, ignoring her muffled cries. She thought she was going to die. But the worst part, the part that broke her spirit completely, was what happened the next morning. Betrayed by blood. Maria sat in a corner of her room, knees pulled to her chest, silent tears streaming down her face. Her entire body ached, and the shame burned deep inside her. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at nothing. When morning came, she finally gathered the courage to tell someone. She rushed to Mrs. Victoria, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Auntie, please help me," she choked out. Mrs. Victoria barely looked up from the basket of vegetables she was chopping. "What is it now?" Maria's voice shook. "It's Gun. He into my room last night. He forced himself on me." She could barely say the words. Her entire body trembled as she waited for her aunt to react. Mrs. Victoria finally looked up. But there was no shock in her eyes. No anger. No concern. She simply sighed and said, "So." Maria felt as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. What do you mean so?" she whispered. Her aunt wiped her hands on her apron and gave Maria a cold, hard stare. "Listen, you little orphan, you should be grateful my son even looks at you. Who do you think will marry a wretched girl like you? Kunal is just teaching you how to be useful." Maria's breath hitched. "Auntie, how can you say that?" Mrs. Victoria clicked her tongue in annoyance. "You are under my roof. You will do as I say. And if you ever open your mouth about this nonsense again, I will throw you out onto the streets. Then let's see who will help you." Maria's body felt numb. Her own aunt knew. Her aunt had let this happen, and she would do nothing to stop it. The end of innocence. Maria walked away in a daze, her soul shattered into a million pieces. That night, when Kunli entered her room again, she didn't scream. She just closed her eyes and let the darkness swallow her whole. But deep inside, something was changing. The pain, the betrayal, the humiliation, they were shaping her into something new. Maria was no longer just a helpless girl. She was a girl with nothing left to lose. And one day, she would make them all pay. Chapter 6, Maria's Revenge. Maria had endured years of suffering, humiliation, and betrayal at the hands of her own family. But she was no longer the scared, helpless girl who had once begged her aunt for mercy. She had transformed into someone stronger, someone who would stop at nothing to bring justice to her parents and expose those who had wronged her. For years, she had been patient. She had observed. She had listened. And now, she had everything she needed, the evidence that would bring them down. One morning, while cleaning her aunt's bedroom, Maria stumbled upon a small envelope hidden beneath the mattress. She had long suspected that her aunt was hiding secrets, and her instincts told her that this envelope might hold something valuable. She carefully opened it and pulled out a letter. As her eyes scanned the words, her heart pounded. It was a love letter. A love letter from a man who was not Mr. Samuel. Her hand shook as she read further. "My love, I hope you are doing well. I think of you and our boys every day. Though we are apart, I am grateful that they are being raised in a stable home. Take care of Kunli and Ayo for me. They are my greatest treasures." Maria gasped. Kunla and Ayo were not Mr. Samuel's biological children. Her mind raced. If Mr. Samuel found out, his entire world would crumble. And that was just the beginning. She rummaged through the rest of the hidden documents and found something even more damning: financial records, proving that Mr. Samuel had been embezzling money from his company for years.
To select a new voice.
Now, she had two weapons in her hands. 1. The proof that Kunli and Ayo were not Mr. Samuel's sons. 2. The evidence that Mr. Samuel was a thief. Maria smirked. It was time to strike. Setting the trap. Maria knew she needed to act carefully. If she confronted them too soon, they might destroy the evidence or silence her forever. So she waited for the perfect moment. And it came soon enough. One evening, while her uncle was away at work and her aunt was in the kitchen, Kunli sneaked into her room as he always did. But this time, Maria didn't resist. She played along. She whispered in his ear, pretending to enjoy his attention. Then she said the words that would seal his fate. "Kunli, do you know that your father isn't really your father?" Kunli froze. "What?" Maria smiled seductively, then leaned in and whispered, "I found the letter. Your mother has been lying to all of you. You and Ayo are not Samuel's children." Kunli's face turned pale. "You're lying," he hissed. Maria chuckled. "I have proof. Do you want to see it?" Kunla hesitated, then nodded slowly. Maria reached under her pillow and pulled out the letter. She handed it to him. As Kunla read the words, his hands trembled. Maria knew exactly what would happen next. Kunla stormed out of her room, ran to his mother, and screamed the truth in her face. Mrs. Victoria's face drained of color. "Where did you hear that nonsense?" She shrieked. Kunla shoved the letter in her face. "This is your handwriting. You lied to us. You lied to Dad." Just as Maria had planned, Mr. Samuel walked into the house at that exact moment. "What's going on?" he asked, confused. Kunla spun around, still fuming. "Dad, no, wait! You're not my dad! Mom cheated on you. We're not your sons." Silence. A deadly, suffocating silence filled the room. Then Mr. Samuel slowly turned to look at his wife. His face darkened. His eyes burned with rage. "Victoria, is this true?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Mrs. Victoria stuttered. I... Then Maria stepped forward, holding the financial documents. "And if that wasn't bad enough," Maria said, her voice calm but firm, "your dear husband has been stealing from his company for years. These records prove everything." Mr. Samuel's face turned red with fury. You knew about this?" Maria shook her head. "No, I just found out. And now, so will everyone else." The climax, the fall of the wicked. Mr. Samuel lost control. He lunged at his wife, screaming, "You ruined my life!" He grabbed her by the throat, shaking her violently. Mrs. Victoria screamed, struggling to break free. Kunla Ayo stood frozen, too shocked to intervene. Maria, however, was calm. She had already called the police before revealing everything. Within minutes, sirens blared outside. The doors burst open, and police officers stormed into the house. Maria turned to face them. "Arrest them all," she said coolly. "I have proof of their crimes." The officers immediately restrained Mr. Samuel, who was still trying to strangle his wife. They handcuffed him and Mrs. Victoria while another officer grabbed Kunli. "What is this about?" Mr. Samuel roared. Maria smirked. "Oh, just a few crimes: embezzlement, child abuse, false accusations, and covering up a murder." Mr. Samuel's face twisted in horror. What do you mean, murder?" Maria's eyes darkened. "The death of my family." The officers played a tape recording, one Maria had secretly made, where Mr. Samuel admitted to taking a bribe from Musa to cover up the truth about the crash. Everyone in the room froze. Mr. Samuel's face turned white. Kunlo's mouth hung open. Mrs. Victoria collapsed to the floor, sobbing hysterically. The police dragged them away. Kunlo and Ayo, the boys who had tormented Maria for years, would now be known as the bastard children of a cheating woman. Their lives were ruined. And Musa? The evidence Maria had collected was enough to have him arrested for vehicular manslaughter and bribery. Justice had been served. Epilogue: The Rise of Maria. With her enemies destroyed, Maria was finally free. She inherited her father's wealth and went back to school. She started a foundation for orphans, ensuring that no child would ever suffer the way she had. Years later, she visited her aunt in prison. Mrs. Victoria, now a broken woman, fell to her knees, begging for forgiveness. Maria looked at her with pity. "I forgave you long ago," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean I will forget." Maria left the prison with her head held high. She had won, and now the world would know her name.